All right. Okay. All right. So we're going to look at things related a little bit to the peripheral nervous system, because we actually are going to talk about those more on Friday with neuro. Talk about some similar things in neuro, but we're going to talk primarily about some central nervous system things that play a role in causing us to move or allowing us to move in certain ways. Okay. So motor systems, there are peripheral systems that are in control in relationship to skeletal muscle movement in particular. This is direct control of what we refer to as a lower motor neuron. Another name for lower motor neuron is the alpha motor neuron. And the other thing is reflexes. We'll just kind of go over a quick relationship of what a reflex is in just a second. We'll talk about more about different kinds of reflexes, as I say, once again on Friday. All right, so what's a reflex? It's a basic motor activity, muscular activity. It's stereotypical motor response. That's very important. Yeah. There are reflexes that basically work the same way all the time. And one of the things clinically that we have to see in a patient is if their reflexive behaviors are working. Okay, and typically, the simplest example of that we'll see in a minute is basically the patellar tendon, where they get their little reflex hand around, they tap your patellar tendon, and you should then wind up extending your leg because of it. Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit more detail about central mechanisms. Of course, the cerebral motor cortex, and is what we call the origin of volitional motor activity. Well, what does that mean? It means if you want to move a certain way, you can just by thinking about wanting to move in a certain way. Okay, you can do it voluntarily. There's no really non-conscious entity that plays a role here. But if you want to raise your hand, if you want to raise your middle finger, you can. Okay. Cerebellum is coordination of voluntary motor activity. Basically, what we have is muscles working together, what we call muscle synergy. And it, in many ways, is directly affected by the cerebral cortex, but the cerebellum really doesn't do much when the cerebral cortex is asleep, so to speak. Okay? When the cortex is not aroused. Then we have basal nuclei, an older name you probably heard some individuals still use it. It's called basal ganglia. Modulation of motor activity regulates motor patterns, movement patterns in relationship to the types of entities that we want to do, either causing them to be more exacerbated or to a greater extent, or reduce their output to a lesser extent. The reason basal nuclei at one time were called ganglion is because everything that was believed to be below the cerebral cortex was believed to be a ganglion through aggregations of nerve cell bodies. But the basal nuclei, interestingly enough, are in the same region of the cerebrum as are all other cerebral cells. They are in what we refer to as the prosencephalon, and particularly the telencephalon portion of that. So what I've got highlighted here are components of a reflex. Okay, all reflexes have a specific type of receptor. Okay, a specific type of receptor. In case of this muscle stretch reflex, or sometimes referred to as a myotatic reflex, their receptor is a stretch receptor, or what we refer to as an intrafusal fiber. It is a tiny little fusiform shaped muscle fiber that is specifically attached to groups of motor units. Okay? And that fiber is the receptor for stretch, and then stretch is what sets off a skeletal muscle to contract. The other thing that you have here, okay, this is what was referred to as a 1 sub alpha, or an annular spiral ending. And we'll see that a little bit this morning, but also tomorrow. It wraps around the center of the spindle, the beginning of the afferent fiber, and then it extends into the posterior root of the spinal cord or into the posterior aspect of the brainstem. Okay, it's also another ending. It's called a type 2 ending, and that is looks like little flowers at the end of the muscle spindle. So they also, 2 of these monitors stretch. Okay? So both cause excitation of an agonist alpha motor neuron and inhibition of an antagonist alpha motor neuron. Okay? So the alpha motor neuron is the neuron that goes to the skeletal muscle itself. Now, skeletal muscles fibers are referred to as extrafusal fibers. Okay? They are not the receptors; they are the effectors. Okay? So they are referred to as extrafusal muscle fibers, and they're at one time in particular, this myotatic reflex, it was believed that there was no interneuron between the incoming afferent fiber, the 1A fiber, and the output fiber to the muscle itself, referred to as the alpha motor neuron. We know now in today's neuroscience, just because technology is improved, we see these entities, that there are interneurons, and that's actually a very significant relationship to this. So the efferent fibers are A sub alpha, okay, or a alpha motor neuron. This is an extrafusal skeletal muscle fiber. The A sub gamma is these intrafusal fibers that are innervated also by components within the anterior horn of the spinal cord or within the anterior portion of the brainstem. So, for example, the spinosynaptic or patellar tendon reflex, okay, basically a feature. The receptor is this muscle spindle, and this muscle spindle, if stretched, will cause a reaction to the motor units within the confines of a skeletal muscle. And that will stimulate, usually caused by the stretching of the muscle itself. And this will cause a input excitation to the posterior horn of the spinal cord or posterior area of the brainstem, and via a fiber that came from this intrafusal fiber called a 1 sub alpha fiber. By definition, there is only one synapse, okay, and that's something that you remember that from the standpoint when you had your final exam in this, that for years and years and years before they had the technology to realize there were neurons involved, they thought it was just the receptor on the end of the 1A afferent fiber stimulating the effector, which was the alpha motor neuron, to the muscle that was stretched. Okay, but now we know better from that standpoint. So the 1A afferents simultaneously now we know excited interneuron, which stimulates a agonist alpha motor neuron. So in other words, the muscle that is being stretched is going to be excited, or the muscle spindle within the muscle being stretched is going to be excited by itself. So this is what we call monogenic excitation. At the same time, though, to facilitate this type of a movement, there is an interneuron which is inhibitory to a muscle which acts antagonistically to the muscle being stretched. Okay? So not having any relationship to the agonist muscle, the muscle being stretched, but to the antagonist muscle, the muscle that would be opposed to that same movement. That's called a reciprocal inhibition. So that facilitates this process. The efferent fiber is an A sub alpha, or alpha motor neuron. The extrafusal muscle fiber, the skeletal muscle, is the effector, which was stretched, the agonist. So just looking at this from the standpoint, here's a patellar tendon reflex. Now, we'll talk about some things with the cerebral cortex, okay? Now, reflexes are reflexes because from this specific stimulus, you typically get a specific response, okay? Can that response be altered? Yes, it can be altered. It can be altered by your thought processes, by your brain. Okay? So, for example, if your physician happens to be sitting out in front of you, which is a dangerous place, they can essentially, if they just get a reflex, that nothing serious is going to happen to them. But for example, maybe you have this kind of negative feeling about your physician, you can think about that in relationship to manifesting this reflex, and you can basically kick them in the groin. Okay? So the reflex can be controlled by the upper motor nervous system, which is primarily related to the cerebral cortex. But typically, we just get a subtle movement of the leg because of the patellar tendon stretch, and that patellar tendon is basically stretching this muscle here in the front. You can see the reflex name of the muscle in the front is called the rectus femoris muscle. That is an extensor under leg. All right, so we're going to be talking about reflexes in a greater deal on Friday in relationship to neuro. But let's look at the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is a site of origin of skeletal muscle movement, volitional control of skeletal muscle movement. Okay? What we want to do in relationship to movement, we think about in regards to our highest motor center, and this is actually what we refer to as the precentral gyrus. If you remember in the cerebral cortex that there are these folds called gyri, and there are grooves between them, spaces between them called sulci. Okay? So if you remember, there was a central sulcus, and on each side of it was a very significant gyrus, and one in front of it was referred to as the precentral gyrus, and one behind it was the postcentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus is the primary volitional motor cortex. Okay? So that's where movement starts in relationship to thinking about how we want to move through our environment. Also, we'll talk about this more in neuro. Rodman was this guy who basically defined all of the cellular regions of the brain, basically not so much by function, but just by the shape and size of their cell bodies, which is kind of interesting. So theoretically, there are 57 Brodmann areas, okay, 54 to 57 Brodmann areas. This precentral gyrus is Brodmann's area 4, okay? So it has really nothing to do directly with function. As neuroscientists went on throughout time, they had a tendency, as they learned more about the brain, to characterize some of these Brodmann areas, these number of Brodmann areas, as certain functional type of entities. All right. So this is the precentral gyrus, this is the primary volitional motor cortex. Then there is a motor cortex area that is just out in front of this and up near the superior aspect of the cerebral cortex, actually overlapping into the medial side of the cerebral cortex, and this is called the supplementary motor cortex. And this is defined as Brodmann's area 6. Now, what this does differently, now if you had a lesion of these two areas, you would be able to tell specifically which one is the area that is really has really been injured with a lesion. Okay, if you saw it, let's say an MRI or some type of other imaging source, you might be able to define that more readily. But just by the lesion itself, the signs and symptoms of it would be the same. Pretty much a paralysis or a weakness of the musculature on the opposite side of the body. So we'll talk about why it's on the opposite side in a second. But this is the area of the cerebral cortex that now takes this motor information and now makes it a little bit more sophisticated in terms of creating a overview of movement patterns. Not just movement itself, but certain types of movement patterns that we have learned over the course of our biological existence and are trying to perform on some regular basis. You know, so not all of us have the same set of movement patterns. Some of us have some that are much more more sophisticated if we had certain forms of athletics or gymnastics or things like that. Then there is an area that is down in front of this precentral gyrus, but below the supplementary cortex, area 6, and this is the extraocular movement or frontal eye fields. This is called broad hues area 8. Now, the difference here is it's kind of interesting. This is something that has to do strictly with the tracking movement of the eyes. Okay, it really doesn't have much in relationship to vision per se itself, but tracking movements of the eyes are. And once the eye is focused on something, if that object starts to move, the eyes will follow it. Okay, the eyes will follow it, and they will follow it until it goes out of sight, unless that person who's interested want to look at something else. There are also areas that are movement that are stimulated by emotional or behavioral types of activities. These are areas in the frontal cortex, or what we refer to as the prefrontal cortex. These are in their compartments, areas 9 to compartments area 12. So these are areas that are associated with emotionally stimulated or behaviorally stimulated movements. All right, so here's the cerebral cortex. It's the same time. All right, so there is the pre-central gyrus there, okay? In front of the precentral sulcus, in front of the central sulcus. And that is in this beige color, and then the blue color is actually behind it. That's the postcentral gyrus. That's the primary somatosensory cortex. And you see these other areas. You see 4 of the 5 cerebral lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe in this particular illustration. Okay, so we have descending motor pathways. Okay, so descending motor pathways are referred to as the upper motor nervous system. These are pathways that start in the cerebral cortex. They typically start mostly in the area of the precentral gyrus or prominence area 4, or they can start in the supplementary motor area in prominence area 6. So these are the pathways that have a direct effect on the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron, once again, is the alpha motor neuron. So they can also affect gamma motor neurons. We'll talk a little bit more Friday about gamma motor neurons. Gamma motor neurons allow for the cerebral cortex to have a greater control of the skeletal muscle movement itself by recruitment of motor units and things of that nature. So these are neuron populations, once again, that are lower motor neurons in the areas of the brainstem, posterior brainstem, anterior brainstem, or anterior spinal. Okay, so the descending pathways as 2 groups are those that are tracts or fasciculi, once again, in these areas that we call funiculi around the gray matter. These are the white matter areas of the spinal cord, white matter areas of the brainstem. These are tracts which control the flexor motor system and what we refer to as fine or discrete movement. The largest population of these tracts is the corticospinal tract. There's basically 2 two well-defined tracts. One is the lateral corticospinal tract, and one is the anterior corticospinal tract. And that's basically just based on their location, but they also descend from the brain to the brainstem in a very specific way. Then we have a little round red nucleus that's just down below the prosencephalon. It's called the red nucleus. This is the cerebrospinal tract. The red nucleus is believed to be more often used in quadrupedal mammals as opposed to bipedal mammals like ourselves in controlling what we call quadrupedal movement. In other words, the ability to move all four limbs in a movement pattern simultaneously. Tectospinal, that, if you remember the spinal tectal system, this is associated with a group of nuclei that sit on the back of the midbrain. That there are two on each side, so there are actually four of them. Those are called folliculi, but all together they're called corpora quadrigemina, four bodies. So tectospinal is a response to things like audiovisual stimuli or even painful stimuli and causing us to move in relationship to things that we see, hear, or feel, at least from the perspective of input of painful sensation. Okay, tracts which regulate anti-gravity muscles. Anti-gravity muscles are the things that help hold us up within the confines of these gravitational force fields that we live in, to either sit up or stand up. So mostly, but the muscles that we use to do this are muscles like keeping the head erect, keeping the back erect, keeping our lower extremity areas erect. These are what we refer to as extensor musculature. Okay? In the back, we call them the erector spine. It's the muscles that help to extend the spine. Okay, so reticulospinal tract. Now remember, the reticulospinal system inputs to a group of nuclei that are anywhere from the medulla up to the top of the pons. And this is called the reticular formation. The reticular formation has a role in receiving literally all sensations. Okay? So from that perspective, they can relay this information through the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. And reticular formation is believed to be important in what we refer to as cortical arousal, especially in one of the primary activities we do usually on a daily basis, that's sleep-awake cycles. The vestibulospinal tract, those tracts have to do with basically keeping us balanced. A lot of the input to the vestibulospinal tract is coming from these little gyroscopes inside your temporal bone called the semicircular canal, the sacral, and the utricle. And those help us keep balance and move in a balanced way through our environment. Other descending tracts, we talked a little bit about this actually in relationship to pain. The raphe spinal tract. The raphe we're talking about here is the midline raphe of the brainstem, and this is in the anterior aspect of the brainstem, and so immediately adjacent to this is these nuclei referred to as raphe spinal nuclei. If you remember, there's a nucleus in there called the large raphe nucleus, or the nucleus raphe magnus. And that receives information from areas such as the locus coeruleus, medulla, and also from higher centers like the periaqueductal gray in relationship to having an effect on sensory neuron populations in different parts of the body in terms of ascending pathways for the control of painful stimuli, kind of reducing the extent of painful stimuli that we may feel. right here is this, we've seen this before. Now we're looking, the first time we saw it, we were looking primarily on your right. We were looking at the tracts or fasciculi anywhere from the top of the brain or the posterior aspect of the spinal cord here to the more inferior aspect of the brain. And these are, once again, these are fasciculi or spinal tracts. On the right side, they are all sensory or ascending tracts. On the left side, the ones that are designated in red are all descending or motor tracts. Okay? So these are all upper motor nervous system tracts on the left side. So, for example, the fasciculus interfascicularis and septum marginalis, they are kind of two tiny little tracts in this posterior funiculus area. Have some very input in relationship to control of either muscles in the lower extremity or muscles in the upper extremity. The lateral corticospinal tract is the main descending motor tract of the nervous system, and the rubrospinal tract, as I said, is not as significant in relationship to human movement, but is in quadrupedal movement. But that doesn't mean that we don't use pathways from the red nucleus. Medullary reticulospinal and pontine reticulospinal tracts. Those are in association with information received by the reticular formation. Vestibulospinal tracts and information received by these receptors within the confines of your temporal bone, your vestibular system, your circular canal, sacral and neutrophil, which are basically monitoring whether you are standing still or monitoring what position your head is in as you are walking through your environment. Spinal pathway as well. Okay. So, corticospinal tracts are associated primarily with your with ascending pathway beginning as what's referred to as the corona radiata. Okay, basically this looks like a sunburst that is descending from the highest centers of the cerebral cortex, from these neuron populations in areas such as the precentral gyrus, the supplementary motor cortex, areas such as the frontal cortex, and so forth, and that this starts to descend from these regions and coalesce as a group of fibers that then pass through a region in the brain that is referred to as the internal capsule. Now, the internal capsule is a significant landmark because what it separates this area of relay nuclei in this area called the thalamus from nuclei that are associated with an area we'll talk about shortly called the basal nuclei. Okay? In particular, it has three entities: the caudate portion, the human portion, and the globus pallidus portion. So these fibers descend between the thalamus and these basonuclear pathways, so it kind of forms a separation or a capsule between them. So this is the internal capsule. Now on each side, those will then descend into the midbrain, the mesencephalon, and they will form interconnections between the higher motor centers, but not just higher motor centers, there are ascending pathways that may be traveling from the thalamus at that point up to the cerebral cortex itself as well. But these are what are referred to as, we call them the brachium conjunctivum, or we call them the cerebral peduncles, the arms that hold the cerebrum to the brainstem. Now, there are three subsets of this corticospinal system. There's one that's called corticobulbar. Another name for it is corticonuclear. And the corticonuclear or corticobulbar pathways are pathways that come from the cerebral cortex, from this Brodmann's area 4, Brodmann's area 6, the primary motor cortex or the supplementary motor cortex. And they come down as far as cranial nerve motor nuclei. Okay? So for example, to the trigeminal motor nucleus, to the facial motor nucleus, to the oculomotor nucleus, to the abducent nucleus, to the trochlear nucleus. These are all motor nuclei that have an effect on skeletal muscles. Okay? And also to motor nuclei associated with nerves such as cranial nerve 9, cranial nerve 10. Okay? So these are this cortical bulbar cortical nuclear tracts. So we haven't left really the brain or the brainstem at this point. So they affect both alpha motor neurons, the primary motor output, and gamma motor neurons, these subsets that allow the brain to have more control over movement in relationship to the number of skeletal muscle fibers it wants to engage. Now, the brainstem portion of the corticospinal tract is both crossed and uncrossed, and that's important. 90% of it crosses from the medulla, from this lowest portion of the brainstem over to the opposite side of the spinal cord. Okay? The opposite side of the spinal cord. This is called the lateral pyramidal tract, or the lateral corticospinal tract. Almost on the front of the spine. And this has the greatest control of your limb girdles. Okay, your limb girdles obviously are the upper extremity and lower extremity. Okay, they arise from the primary motor cortex. Now, about 8 to 10% of the corticospinal pathway is part of the anterior corticospinal pathway, and this crosses over at the right commissure. Does it cross from the brain to the brainstem, or from the brainstem to the spinal cord? It stays on the same side, but it will cross over at different spinal level segments to the opposite side. So it's crossed secondarily as it has descended from the brain. But the lateral corticospinal pathway crosses immediately from medulla to spinal. So both of these synapses on alpha motor neurons and gamma motor neurons, interneurons in some ways, because you get some greater control of muscle synergy. The first order cells are in the cerebral cortex, primary motor cortex, or the precentral gyrus. If you remember these pathways or these cell populations, we talked about them in head and neck. We talked about this term called an homunculus. We can talk about it again in general, looking at the nervous system. What's a homunculus? How would you describe a homunculus?
Creature of myth generally created from the earth.
Good, Ryan. You're always good for brain. Okay. But by definition, what would you call it? Have you ever seen one on the street? Or maybe down here in the atrium? It's an inverted, distorted humanoid image. Okay. It's an inverted, distorted humanoid image. So basically, it's a representation of the body upside down, typically pictured on the lateral side of the precentral gyrus or postcentral gyrus as well. And so the feet are represented on the top, actually top medial side of the precentral gyrus, and the head and areas of the throat are located on the lower portion of that gyrus in terms of the nuclear population affecting motor neurons, or sensory neurons. It's distorted because not all areas have the same amount of output. Okay, for example, in humans in particular, our hands are the most enlarged area of motor output in relationship to the motor homunculus. Okay, so these tracts control, once again, flexor motor system and fine movement. Here's an example of these tracts. Okay, so if we see over here in relationship to the medullary area, over here, 90% of these tracts cross to the opposite side. Okay, so in this case, it's from, if we're looking at it, we're looking at the left and the right. It's crossing from the left to the right side. but about 10% of it is not crossing. It's going down on the same side, or what we call ipsilateral. Okay, so when we use the term contralateral, we do the opposite side, ipsilateral, to the same side. Okay, and then they will cross individually as they get down to other areas of the spinal cord. Now, they believe that there are about 2% of these pathways that also do not cross at all. Okay, so of this anterior system, there are pathways that directly go through the same sided motor nuclei, or alpha motor neurons, and don't cross to the opposite side for any reason. So they are same sided. And that's why in some individuals, depending upon, for example, that have had spinal cord injury, they still have a significant amount of different types of movement associated with either the fact that the anterior cortical spinal system is still untouched, and this 2% of this descending pathway is untouched at all, at least on one side.
Okay, so 90% is contralateral or 90% is?
90% is contralateral, okay? The other 10%, including this 2% that doesn't cross at all, the anterior cortical spinal system, is the rest of the pathways. It descends on the same side, but then does enter, for the most part, crosses over about 8% and cross over about 2% of the do not. All right, so let's move on to our friend the cerebellum. Cerebellum is an interesting area of the brain. If you remember, it kind of sits down there underneath the cerebral cortex, you know, in the cranial wall. That's separated by a dural tent that separates it from the underside of the cerebral cortex, called tentorial cerebelli, and sits in the posterior cranial fossa. And if you cut it in half, it looks like a tree, where the neuron populations on the outside look like leaves and the branches are white matter pathways coming from those neuron populations that look like branches. So it has retained this definition of arbor vitae. No significant functional perspective, but at least from a image perspective, the arbor vitae is what you see when the cerebellum is cut down the middle sagittal. All right, so what does the cerebellum do? Okay, the cerebellum will consolidate the information that it receives and coordinates motor activity by controlling the timing of movement, the speed of movement, the precision of movement. It provides a give and take between primary motor and primary motor cortex, or what I consider for the prefrontal gyrus, and the premotor cortex, or supplementary motor cortex just in front of it. Now, if you remember that the cerebellum, we talked about ascending pathways. The cerebellum also receives a lot of information from the muscles themselves in relationship to what they are doing at a given point in time, coming from proprioceptive entities. Okay, so what is a proprioceptive receptor? It's things such as a muscle spindle, but also in relationship to Golgi tendon organs, okay, which are on the innervation that is coming from the tendinous attachments of the muscle to bone. Okay, so monitoring the amount of tension that's being created there. So these are proprioceptive inputs, like the posterior spinal cerebellar pathway, the cranial pathway, the anterior spinal cerebellar pathway, and the cerebellar pathway. So the cerebellum can help in the prediction of the consequences of movement. In other words, the cortex has, and the supplementary cortex in particular, has locked in its certain types of movement patterns that you've performed or learned to perform over the course of your life. Some of them are behavioral or habitual, and that may have been basically passed on to you by, basically by phylogenetic type of phylogenetic type of relationship from your ancestors. Okay, and it's kind of locked in there, and it keeps getting passed down from generation to generation. Okay. So the cerebellum can help in the prediction of the consequences of this movement. In other words, it knows which muscles it needs to it needs to work with and how much output and how they need to move in relationship to one another to basically give us nice, neat, and clean movement patterns. Okay? So it's coordinating all of the skeletal muscle activity. It plays a role in the maintenance of posture, just being able to stand. It plays a role in balance as we're moving through our environment, and it plays a particular role in muscle tone. Okay? Muscle tone, we can't just go from relaxation to contraction. There are times in between when we need to stand for periods of time, and we need to have muscle tone, for example, in our lower extremity to do that. But we may not need as much muscle tone in our lower extremity if we're sitting on our butt. Okay? So the cerebellum is trying to help to synergistically control the muscles that we need to move for a specific type of movement. So what inputs it? Primarily the motor cortex. Primarily the motor cortex. Because the cortex is where the movement that the body, that the nervous system, so to speak, specifically, wants to perform. And sending this information to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is then evaluating this movement, deciding how the movement is going to work. You'll see there's another system involved here, the basal nuclei, and to refine the output from the standpoint of muscle synergy. Muscle synergy is getting different muscle groups to work together to form a given movement task. Visual cortex, certainly, we are an organism that uses our visual system to monitor what's going on within the confines of our environment on I guess you would say a per second basis. As long as we're awake and aroused, we can see what's going on in relationship to our environment. We can move as a consequence of what we see in relationship to our environment. Auditory cortex, similar, okay? Now, we're not talking about here, we're not talking about vestibular function or balance, we're talking about what we hear in our environment that may make us, want to move, okay? In relationship to our environment. So something, like out here when you're crossing Chester on a daily basis, okay, all of a sudden, you may be ready to cross, but and the light is in your favor, but you hear somebody revving their engine like they're going to go through that light without thinking about the consequences of that. So you're going to maybe adjust your movement in relationship to something like that. Or maybe, someone steps in front of you, and so you're going to see that maybe there's going to step in front of you and they're going to turn around and talk to you. So you're going to modify your movement in relationship to what type of audiovisual input you're receiving at that given point. The vestibular system is pretty much, what it's doing is it is really monitoring what your head position is as we move through our environment, okay? As we move through our environment. We can adjust our head posture and still move through our environment successfully as long as the nervous system knows what's going on, knows what that posture is, knows what modifications it has to make in order to move through the environment successfully. Somatosensory cortex, okay, somatosensory cortex is bringing in all of this general sensations, including proprioception, but also things like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, that could cause you to cause the nervous system to want to modify your position or your movement in relationship to those sensations. Okay. Spinal cerebellar pathways, we talk about this. These are primarily, this is unconscious proprioception. Who is conscious proprioception? Where's conscious proprioception? And in that question I asked you in relationship to the neuro, yeah, okay. That probably is a little bit more than you needed to say, okay. Because conscious proprioception from that perspective of that young lady who was in the automobile accident, maybe or maybe not, but that, remember, those were posterior pathways, and there was really a lateral displacement of the spinal cord, or the spinal nerves. Okay, there's this.
Lisa, where is just for research?
not just proprioception associated with the dorsal columns, medial meniscus system, and posterior fibulus, fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus crassus. Okay. All right. So, what are some of the parts of the cerebellum? Well, phylogenetically, over the course of time, the cerebellum is just like the cerebral cortex. It's kind of grown off the top of this insular cortex, this deep cortical region, which was one of the early forms of cerebral cortical activity, which was associated mostly with visual or behavioral types of activities. Okay, and grew into this large expanse on the top of this, associated with things like we needed more memory because every day of our lives over the course of 6 million years, we gained as a population of organisms, we gained more information and needed to store it someplace. So pretty much the largest population relationship to the cerebral cortex is related to the storage of memory, what we call association cortex. But anyway, from that same standpoint, those are areas that grew in the cerebral cortex. The biggest area of our cortex now is that called neocortex, and then we got a little bit younger than that, was paleo. In the cerebellum, there is the oldest portion of the cerebellar cortex is referred to as the archicerebellum, archi meaning old, and this is called the floccular nodular lobe, and it's primarily associated with things like static posture and vestibular system and balance, things like that. Paleocerebellum is the anterior most low portion of the cerebellum. It came about a little bit later on from the archicerebellum. Things became more sophisticated in terms of as we started to learn how to move through our environment in terms of certain types of movement patterns. And then the largest portion of the cerebellum is the posterior lobe, or the neocerebellum, which is the newest or more contemporary aspect of the cerebellum, which is taking in this huge amount of information from our cerebral cortex, both based on some kind of sensory input over the course of 6 million years and motor output over the course of 6 million years.
No.
So I'll show you an image. I'll show you an image of that. We have a midline structure in the cerebellum that looks like a worm that runs down the center, and that's called the vermis. So there's some subcategories. I don't expect you at this point in time to have a specific idea of which one of these vermiform areas go, as opposed to lobular areas and so forth. The anterior lobe has these different little sublobes in it, like the lingula, the central lobule, the culmen, the lingula, and so forth. Posterior lobe is associated with some other vermal areas as well. And floccular nodular lobe, the flocculus and the nodulus. Flocculus means flower. Okay, so the nodulus is a central enlargement in the center. The flowers are on the extremes, on the left and right. And once again, Roman numerals define this little vermal area. You'll see this in a second. All right, so what's the role of the anterior lobe? That's the paleocerebellum. These are the spinal cerebellum. So what is coming in here is everything in relationship to unconscious proprioception. So the spinal cerebellar pathways have their primary input into the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, okay? Controls anti-gravity musculature. The sensors receives proprioceptive input from the trunk and lips, primarily the hands and feet. Concerned with the control of posture and muscle. The posterior lobe, or the neocerebellum, is referred to as the pontocerebellum or cerebrocerebellum. Now, the cerebral cortex, when it impacts the cerebellum, does not impact it directly. It impacts it by sending information to nuclear groups in the pons. If if you do a hemotoxin adhesive staining of the ponds, it comes out like a tremendous amount of pink with little black dots in it because of the chrome material. A huge number of nuclei, in particular motor nuclei associated primarily with cranial nerves, but also with some populations like reticular formation, medulla, and so forth in regards to lower extent of the body. So before the cerebral information goes to the cerebellum, synapses and nuclei in the pons, the primary apparent pathway to the cerebellum from the cerebral cortex is referred to as the pontocerebellar pathways or cerebrocerebellar pathways. So this is the information coming from the cerebral cortex via these pontonuclei. And this is what is concerned with skill movement, motor planning, and initiating motor cortex. So as we become more sophisticated over the course of our lives, or over the course of our time on this planet, so to speak, we have learned some very sophisticated types of movements. Some of you more than others, okay? Like right now, everybody is not trying to become a dentist. At least I don't know that, but I'm assuming that. But, the types of motor skills that you will develop over the course of your four years, and I hope it's only 4, unless you're going to graduate school. Okay, but from the same standpoint, those are very refined skills. Not everybody can do that. We're talking about, you work in basically the largest surface area you work on is an area that may be about anywhere from 8 to 10 millimeters quartz in diameter. Okay, that's small. That's small. Okay, follicular nodule. The archicerebellum is the vestibulocerebellum. It receives information from the vestibular system. These are these semicircular canals, sacral and utricle. Sacral and utricle are pretty much monitoring static posture. Okay, the semicircular canals are monitoring dynamic movement. Okay, so they are centered in 3 ways: either vertically, horizontally, or obliquely. And so as you move your head and as we move through space, the inertia caused by movement of little sand-like particles inside of there have an effect on a group of hair cells, really just like in some ways hearing or sound waves have on the organ of hearing. That causes the body to know when you are moving and how you are moving, whether you're moving dynamically or you are static. Okay? Remember, I told you a long time ago, okay, what are some of the things that can happen, for example, in something like a middle ear infection, okay? All infections have not just necessarily dolor or pain, but they also have calor or heat, okay? And what does heat do to liquids? It causes the molecules of liquids to start moving, right? Start, not necessarily boiling in the semicircular canals, but moving. That liquid movement caused by heat, by infection in the middle ear, artificially causes movement of the fluid inside of the semicircular canals to move. So you may have a middle ear infection that is so bad or so chronic that when you try and get out of bed in the morning, the movement of those sensors is becoming artificial inside there, and you feel dizzy or you feel nauseous because you feel like the room is spinning. Well, the room's not spinning, but the fluid inside the semicircular canals is moving and it's causing your nervous system to think that you're moving. Okay, you think the room is moving. So things like that. Okay, so here's the larger cerebral cortex and the smaller cerebellum, smaller than okay, and then this area under here is the brainstem. If we look at a cerebellum from the standpoint of its anatomy, you see, looking down on it, looking down on the top of it, you see this area here. That's the vermis, or the worm, okay? And then out here are lateral lobes. Here, and then you see that, if you look at the side here over on your left, there's a demarcation on the top side. It says the primary fissure, okay? The primary fissure separates the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, or the anterior lobular areas of the cerebellum, with the posterior lobular areas of the cerebellum. So everything in front of the primary fissure is the anterior lobe, okay? Those are your spinal cerebellar pathways, okay, coming in there. The back of that, the primary input in there is the input mostly from the cerebral cortex. That is your posterior neocerebellum. That is your input that is coming from the cerebral cortex itself. That's your neocerebellar pathways. You cannot see at this point. You can't see the flocculus or the nodulus. Verbus is this midline structure. There are cell populations in there too that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But let's look at the underside of this so we can see. Here is over here, that's the flocculus. Maybe something on this one. And then in the center there would be a nodulus, okay, a little nodule joining the right flowers. Okay, these are the cerebellar tonsils. We talked about those before? I'm not sure. We talked about the brain a little bit, okay? The brain's got so much space inside the cranial ball. Okay? If something else grows in there, whether inside the brain or alongside of it, or something takes up that space, it could be fluid, it could be blood, it could be a tumor, okay? The brain's got no place to go other than inferior. What's the opening and inferior aspect of the skull? Foramen magnum, okay? So those tonsillar areas lie on each side. What's in the middle here would be the brain stem. So the brain stem. So as the brain gets pushed down, these cerebellar tonsils can start to compress the medulla, okay? What type of neuron populations are in the medulla that control things outside the medulla? What are those centers? There's the cardiovascular center controlling the heart, and there's the respiratory center controlling breathing. So if the pressure is great enough to impact those cell populations in the respiratory center or the cardiac center, then what can happen is that you can shut off, you can have an effect on heart rate, you can reduce heart rate or stop the heart, or you can reduce respiration, okay? And same kind of thing happens with a high spinal cord injury. Yes?
What would cause the tonsils to compress? There's injury?
If there are several things. Intracranial tumor that's growing, trauma to the brain, concussions, where the bleed is not stopping, but it's slowly expanding, like a subdural or epidural hematoma, or some type of cerebral spinal fluid blockage, which is increasing pressure inside of the brain. And so it's like blowing up a balloon, and the brain is expanding. It's got nowhere to expand other than inferiorly towards the foramen magnum. So these are all things that could cause the brain to be pushed down, and particularly in cerebellar tonsillar areas, as the brain is pushed down to be compressed by the lateral walls of the foramen magnum. Okay, you want to take a break? Why don't you take a 5-minute break?
realize I have to articulate it.
So does the rest of the class say just sleep in?
Sleeping.
I mean, I don't really care, that's not right. Yes,
What's the function of the tonsils?
cerebellar tonsils?
Yeah.
There are cerebellar nuclei, that's posterior lobe, that's the lower part of the posterior lobe, so some cerebral cortical pathways are coming there that are directly associated with muscle synergy somewhere in the body in regards to the straight movements. Okay. I mean, the tonsillar significance is potentially causing excessive pressure on respiratory neurons or cardiac neurons in the brain stem, or just more of a, that's just a clinical consequence of those areas of the cerebellum.
Supports, yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Landers, did you get my email about the TVO? Like some of the questions were.
I'm in the process of looking at it right now. And by the way, I will be posting your written blood grades this.
Did we all do okay?
He was 71% after I went through and what I was waiting for was Dr. Somiano to review his questions. So all of the questions were reviewed, so it was, originally the original school scoring percentage was 66% for me prior to reviewing the questions. It's like, so, we do look at this seriously. It's not that they're bad questions, but sometimes because of things that were discussed from the lecture, you may be drawn towards an answer that is close, but not really, at that point in time, eliminated from the answer pool, so to speak. And then there were some questions that were just made. And then there were my questions where I asked the same question, three different ways, but I had three different answers. But that was easy to fix. Okay. I mean, aren't you having fun at Del Sol so far? I mean, we've only got to deal with stress. This year, I'm only going to deal with stress myself.
Yes.
The power go out. It's weird. The power go out here.
Is Malachi?
Yes. The lights are all just like flashing. Just shut down.
Yeah.
Chester, whatever.
Malachi.
Yeah, it's Chester. The school is just sucking up the power of it. It's like a green building. I don't think it is. Thank you, yeah, that's what
They were like,
Yeah, the thing. Underground. Here. Like, upside down.
Still be asked.
Yeah, so
everyone has.
Friday or Saturday or something like that.
You did this one.
Yeah.
Doctor did
Same for MS, are we doing
Yep.
radiant pulses at all or no? Because this is the last class.
Well, we looked at,
So basically,
Dude, I worry about that. Like, could be like, all right, here's the next one.
Yeah, so might as well just start them from now. I'm not gonna wait until we want to.
To the arts.
I mean, I'm not sure if you're, the arm
I was there for a while.
I have like 3 professors helping with it.
That's
Once you
pretty
get
ask
another person
trying
to
to
look at
show
it,
how
I know, I know.
surrender takes place.
I need a month off for that.
So you should have an idea of what we're talking about. What's that?
I think it's like, I think it's advice. You what? At least for our
Those areas.
I haven't really gone to
That wouldn't even have passed.
So you should know that. You should know how those approaches relate to those are the things.
I was like, you could have used that pen. You didn't put it in real.
Dude, buy it.
All right.
Like,
Here's
good
my
luck.
spinal cord.
Where's the dude?
It's sensation to interrupt me.
Yeah, a little bit.
I'm out of charge.
Should maybe go see. I mean, yeah, probably don't need surgery. I just need to fix it.
Okay, so here's a schematic overview of the cerebellum, showing this midline Roman numeral designated areas. That's the vermis, that's the worm, okay? And then showing there is a nomenclature used to describe the lobules which are out alongside of that, okay? Also, that primary fissure, you see the anterior lobe is being designated in a light gray, and the posterior lobe in white, and the flaccular nodular lobe basically in black. Okay, so those are the 3 lobular areas, or the archicerebellum, the paleocerebellum, and the cerebrocerebellum.
Does each of the different dermal regions have a different function? Or what's the indication of dermal?
I'll get to that. There are populations of nuclei that have given out. So let's look at that right now. Primary cells in the cerebellum are basically like on and off switches. This structure here in the middle is one of the most significant areas, and also these guys out here. I call them smurfs. Because they're blue and they're always designated as blue. That circle with that little yellow area surrounded by these little black spacemen, that is called the cerebellar glomerulus. And that yellow entity is the cell body that is receiving information in the cerebellum from a fiber called a mossy fiber. So all mossy fibers look like that. Mossy fiber is the primary input from all areas of the body to the cerebellum. Spinal cerebellar pathways, okay, cerebrocortical pathways are coming in there as well, and they are ending in this area, okay? Now, since this little yellow structure years ago, you know, it's just things passed down from generation to generation. They refer to that as being a entity that looks like a flower, okay? That looks like a flower. So, so this is called the mossy fiber rosette. And the mossy fiber rosette is bringing information to the little black spacemen, and those are called Golgi cells. And that is the primary input. There's another input out here, but it only comes from one area. And this is called climbing fibers, and it only comes, if you remember that little bump on the side of the midbrain called the olive, or the olivary nucleus, which has to do with vestibular function. It's a relay from vestibular receptors to the cerebellum. That is the only other input cell. Yes.
Is this motor input?
Sensor. Its input is a parent sensor. I understand what you're saying, Joe. I mean, from that standpoint, since the cerebellum in particular is receiving sensory input, for example, in relationship to proprioception, but it's receiving input also from the cerebral cortex in relationship to what type of motor activity the cerebral cortex wants to do, but it's still a parent to the cerebellum. All right, so the Golgi cell has a primary effect on the dendritic processes of the only output cell of the cerebellum, and that is this cell here. That is the Purkinje fiber. So here you see picture 3 Purkinje fibers. So those go out. Those take the information that the cerebellum has coalesced, has said, okay, if you want to do this movement, we've got to do this, this, and this. Okay. So that is the primary output. What the Golgi cell does is it takes the information from the mossy fiber rosette and impacts the dendritic processes of the Purkinje fiber. Okay? Of the Purkinje fiber. It takes it up to the outer layers of the cell populations of this so-called tree, the arbor vitae, where the cells are on the outside, and takes that information and modifies different Purkinje cells to get the type of movement it needs. Now, although the Purkinje fiber is the only output, it doesn't directly output to anything other than it does have, there are some Purkinje cells that go directly to the vestibular nuclei. But those are the only ones that go directly to any nuclei outside the cerebellum. All of the other cerebellar Purkinje cells impact nuclei that are just down in the lower extent of the cerebellum. They are called deep cerebellar nuclei. Okay. So once again, excitatory afferents from the spinal cord, brainstem, inhibitory cerebellar outputs from cortical Purkinje cells to deep cerebellar nuclei. Outputs from deep cerebellar nuclei are excitatory in relationship to the inhibition of deep cerebellar nuclei is usually partial. Okay, it's not complete, but they typically have a way of taking the information that they're given and allowing the deep cerebellar nuclei to modify the output in relationship to what movement is going to be done. Okay. So let's look at these deep cerebellar nuclei. Okay. There is one that looks like a row of teeth. So it's called the dentate nucleus, and it's outmost lateral, and that's output to the thalamus. Okay. So this is not. If you remember, there was this ventral posterior lateral nucleus in the thalamus and ventral posterior medial, which were receiving most ascending information from the body or from the head. This is different. This is ventral lateral. This is a little bit more out lateral instead of anterior as opposed to posterior. So this influences the movement of proximal limb musculature by anterior cortical spinal what's proximal musculature? That's your areas of your thighs and your shoulders, okay? Or your arm articulation points or movement points within your shoulders and your thigh relationships to your pelvis. Then there are two little nuclei that are in the middle, and they're called the interpoise nucleus because they're in the middle. One's called the emboliform nucleus, it has nothing to do with the disease, and the other is called the globus because it's shaped like a ball. And the output here goes both to the red nucleus, remember this nucleus associated with quadrupedal movement, and the ventrolateral nucleus. And then this information goes specifically to the supplementary motor cortex in relationship, or premotor cortex in relationship to movement patterns, specific movement patterns, planning, initiation, timing, precision of movements. Then there is a nucleus that is basically right in the middle, not the interpoise are between the dentate and this nucleus called vestigial, and this projects to the vestibular nuclei that are in the lower brainstem, and they are associated with information they are receiving from the semicircular canals of sacral. They influence posture and the activity of proximal musculature. Okay, once again, where's proximal musculature? So I've got a photomicrograph of that, but in order to save time and space, this is what these nuclear positions are. Okay, this area here, this is the fourth ventricle. Okay. So it's interesting the way this is drawn because when you make this cut 9 times out of 10, you wind up with a piece of cerebral cortex in the fourth ventricle. So the illustrator here in this book by Haynes drew that little piece of cortex floating in the center of the fourth ventricle. And on top of the fourth ventricle is the cerebellum, okay? And in the base of the cerebellum are these nuclei. The lateral one is colored in light blue. That's the dentate, looks like a row of teeth. The emboliform and the globus are more medial in position, and the vestigial nucleus is more central in position. So these are all the deep cerebellar nuclei. So now the output from here goes in relationship to motor systems or information being relayed now back to the cerebral cortex, having had the information come from the cerebral cortex in relationship to what kind of movement it wants to do. It's now going to have refined the movement, it's going to send it back to the cerebral cortex, and it's going to send it out some more. Now that doesn't mean it's going to stop there. Okay? We're talking about fibers that are transmitting as much as 120 meters per second. So all of this stuff is being relayed between these regions very quickly so that we can perform movement in an efficient time base. But now in relationship to a question, Brian, you asked that in relationship to the vermis, what's in the vermis? Okay, so now the dentate nucleus is more lateral and it is receiving Purkinje cell input from the lobes, from these lobes down here. The vermis is this gray area over here, and this is sending information to the interpoise nucleus. Okay? That's Purkinje fibers to the interpoise nucleus. And then there is an area that is adjacent to the vermis laterally and adjacent to the lobes medially, and that is referred to as the paravermis. Yeah.
And the gray.
Yeah.
Ventricle?
Yeah, I don't know what they do if they throw the switch, because without electricity or batteries, things like that, we can't do anything. So obviously the battery in this instance, they had 2, and I took the wrong one, is dead. So I can't use this. All right, so Purkinje cells in the lobes go to the dentate, okay? Purkinje cells in the vermis go to the vestigial nucleus, and the ones in between go to the intervoice nucleus, the emboliform nucleus. Okay, and then the output goes from those nuclei to the specific areas that essentially they came from. Now, there are arms in the cerebellum that are called peduncles, just like there were brachium conjunctival or cerebral peduncles or arms. There are cerebellar peduncles. There's 3 cerebellar peduncles. And what's important to understand there is that the direction of flow of the fibers, are they coming to the cerebellum? Are they afferent to the cerebellum? Are they leaving the cerebellum? Are they efferent from the cerebellum? So, for example, the superior cerebellum, if you remember, one of the pathways that came into the cerebellum from the superior peduncle was a pathway that was associated with the spinocerebellar system, primarily the anterior spinocerebellar tract. But pathways here that are efferent, okay, dento-rubrothalamic, that is deep cerebellar nuclei sending information from the dentate nucleus to the red nucleus and the thalamus, ventrolateral nucleus. Also from the interpoise nucleus to the red nucleus and the thalamus, ventrolateral nucleus are coming out of the cerebellum and going to these pathways. And then vestigiothalamic from the cerebellum, vestigial nucleus to the thalamus, and vestigiovestibular going from the vestigial nucleus to the vestibular nucleus. Okay? All right. However, then the information coming in now. So this is a two-way arm. Output arm, efferent, and afferent arm, information coming in. So anterior spinal thalamic tract, rostrocerebellar tract. Now rostro doesn't cross, but it extends to this area adjacent to this peduncle. Trigeminal thalamic tract, rubrocerebellar tract, tectocerebellar tract, cerulocerebellar tract. Okay, that's in the medulla, the blue nucleus. So the superior peduncle is both efferent output from the cerebellum, but also afferent input to the cerebellum from these different pathways. Now the middle peduncle is called the brachium pons. There are no efferent pathways from the cerebellum to the pons and then to the cerebral cortex. All of the information in the pons ascends into the cerebellum. These are the relays from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. So it's only an afferent pathway, and it's the largest arm. It's the largest peduncle. The inferior cerebellar peduncle, it can be divided in half. There is one what is referred to as sort of kind of the midline portion of this arm. If you remember, 2 of the spinocerebellar pathways enter into the cerebellum via this peduncle. The posterior and the cuneo-cerebellar pathways, okay, are entering through this area. But also trigeminocerebellar, olivocerebellar from the inferior olivary nucleus, this little bump on the side of the medulla, and the reticulocerebellar nucleus coming from reticular formations either in the medulla or the pons. So this is called the restiform body. It's only afferent. It's only input to the cerebellum. Juxtarestiform is all afferent and efferent. Okay, so the afferent portion is information coming from the vestibular nuclei. So that comes in from the vestibulocerebellar pathway. The efferent output here is cerebellovestibular or cerebellovestibular. Okay. So the cerebellovestibular is responding to information in association with balance. The cerebellovreticular is responding to information that is gathered by the reticular formation and a variety of sensations that it receives, okay, in regards to really cortical neurons. Okay, so cerebellar relationships, sensory motor cortex, that's the postcentral gyrus. It has a relationship there from the thalamus, motor and premotor cortex, visual association cortex, spinal auditory tract, brain nucleus, and so forth. All of these sensory motor cortical regions, in other words, sensations that create motor output, okay? Motor adaptation is primarily a cerebellar function. For example, walking uphill versus walking on a flat surface. Because what do we have to do if we're walking on uphill? You know, like we're coming in here in the morning, you know, from the river, the Cleveland Clinic River, you know, and I don't know what kind of grade it is, but it's probably at least a 3% grade, okay? So we have to take modifications. What do we have to take modifications? So we fall backward, okay, in relationship to that. So we need a little bit more information in regards to muscle synergy to walk up a hill as opposed to walking on a flat surface. Motor sequence of learning begins in infancy. Think about this. You know, it's hard to go back that far for most of us. But, you know, when we started to crawl, or when we started to stand up, or, you know, when we started to feed ourselves. But these are all movements that were developed, that we learned over the course of our early lives, you know, after getting out of the womb, you know. So motor sequence learning begins early in infancy. All right, cerebellar dysfunctions. And each one of these areas, cerebellum and basal nuclei, I've got a list of definitions. So look at it. It talks about this. So what's a dysmetry? We talked about dysmetry before, okay? What happens in a dysmetry? Okay, what happens if you're stopped on the highway and the highway patrolman behind your car notices that you happen to be, you know, swerving from side to side, okay? They'll have you get out of your car, they'll have you stand together, they'll have you put your feet together, and one of the things they'll have you do is they'll have you, with your eyes open, take your index finger, fold your other fingers up, take your index finger, and alternately go and touch the tip of your nose. And they ask you to close your eyes, okay? If anterior lobe of the cerebellum is the lobe that's primarily affected by chronic alcohol abuse, okay? So if that happens, then when you try and do that and you're intoxicated, what may happen here with your eyes closed is you may not make it to your nose. You may, you know, gotta go over here or go up here, okay? That's called pass pointing. That's a dysmetria, okay? That's a dysmetria. The other thing that they might have you do, you know, I told you, do you remember positive rumble sign? Do you remember that? Okay. So what's a positive rumble sign? So now we're standing here and our eyes are open, okay? And our hands are at our side and we're okay. We can, you know, okay, we're standing still. Then we close our eyes, okay? And we start to lose track of our environment. We start to sway from side to side. That's a positive rumble sign. So that's, you know, these are both signs of cerebellar disease. So you can always do, you know, if they stop you, just say, you know, you just came from the neurologist. He said you got some cerebellar problems, you know, or don't let me do the breathalyzer. Okay. Then there are things that are also associated with the anterior lobe dysarthria, problems with speech. Okay. So you cannot coordinate your tongues, your lips together in order to speak clearly. So you speak, I don't know, what do you say? I don't really know. What, you know what? So your voice is varying, your articulation is varying, so that's a dysarthria. See, in basal nuclear disease, they're also dysarthria. Then there's this $10 word, dysdiadochokinesia. Dysdiadochokinesia is an exam that neurologists will use. Since I had stroke, I get it's not personal memory. It's rapid alternating movements. So like palms up, palms down, palms up, palms down, palms up, palms down, palms up, palms down. My right side was affected a little bit more than my left, so I'm a little bit slower on the right in doing that rapidly alternating movement. Decomposition and movement, that's sort of like, you know, you're having trouble moving through your environment because you're not coordinated, you're not balanced, and things like that. Titubation, that's an interesting one. Titubation is called bobbleheadedness, okay? You know, like you go to the baseball game or the football game to get a bobblehead doll. Okay, so you can become a bobblehead doll with cerebellar disease. So you're walking through your environment, but your head is oscillating like this, and you can't stop it from oscillating. Okay, so it's basically wobbling on your shoulder. That's titubation, or bobblehead. And then there's a tremor. Now, this tremor, it's important because we'll talk about another tremor shortly with the basal nuclei. This is an intention tremor. What does that mean? That means when you reach to pick up something, for example, just one more can of beer out of that apex, okay? Your hand starts to shake. If you stop moving, it stops, okay? If you go again, you try to pick it up, and your hand starts to shake. Or anything else you try to pick up. That's an intention tremor. The tremor starts when you start to move, you start to try and move.
Is that what it's volume?
Yes. Because we'll see in basal nuclear disease that there's a tremor, but it's not voluntary. All right, and here's a list of, some of these things in relationship to this. Truncal ataxia, wide-spaced, unsteady gait, drunken gait, your feet are farther apart because you're afraid you're going to lose your balance. When you walk out of the establishment on Saturday night, something like that. But an ataxia is a loss of coordination. Ataxias are common to cerebellar diseases. All right, so let's look at this last very interesting area of the motor system, basal nuclei. All right, so what does this system do? Okay, decisions to move. Okay, so you're going to move. What direction are you going to move in? So how are you going to set up from the standpoint of the output, the amplitude of movement, how much of the output are you going to give? What's the amount of force you're going to give, or the amount of motor output, modulation of this movement, motor expression of emotion, okay? Motor expression of emotion. This is a basal nuclear related issue, and cognitive processes in their behavioral output are also associated with basal nuclear function. Okay, cognitive means known movements, okay, things that you know. Not necessarily learn, but things that you know. We can subdivide the basal nuclei into what we refer to, sometimes the basal nuclei group are called the striated bodies, the corpus striatum. If you look at them under a microscope, even without any type of staining, they look striped. So hence the term the striatum. The newest aspect, once again, of the striatum is called neostriatum, and there are three nuclear populations of the basal nuclei that can be classified here. And this is the input side. This is what's receiving information primarily from the cortex, but also from areas such as the substantia nigra, which we'll talk about in a minute. So caudate nucleus is really the dorsal input side, the putamen, and the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens is interesting because it has to do with kind of like facial expression, muscles of facial expression. Okay? And it's not an easy nucleus to find. It's in the ventral input side. Okay? Now, the paleostriatum, not quite as new, but not archy, not old. That is the globus pallidus, and that is the dorsal portion of the output side. Okay? The globus pallidus is the output side. Now, there's two portions of it. There is a medial or internal aspect of the globus pallidus, and a lateral or external aspect of the globus pallidus. Now, if you notice also, I have these asterisks here with the putamen and the globus pallidus. They lie directly adjacent to one another. And when you look at them in section, you'll see that in a second. They look like a prism, like a lens. So together they call them the lentiform nuclei. The globus pallidus and the putamen look like a prism or a lens, a lenticular formation. We talk about smell in neuro. We will have relationship to another nucleus called the amygdala. Looks like an almond. Okay, and the amygdaloid nucleus was thought for many years to be archistriatum. We know now it's more of a insular area or functional cortical area as opposed to a basal nuclear area. Okay, so the four nuclei together are the corpus striatum, but together the putamen and the lobus pallidus, they are referred to many times as a lenticular or lentiform nuclei. Here we see it looking from lateral to medial. We've cut out the side of the cerebral cortex, primarily from the lower frontal and parietal lobes, and we see here this nucleus right here. That's the outside of the putamen. That's the outside of the putamen. Inside of that would be globus pallidus, and you can't see that. Okay. This nuclear area here, that is actually the thalamus. That is the medial side of the thalamus. Now, running between those areas are pathways that I referred to before as the internal capsule. Okay? So between the thalamus, the putamen, and actually the globus pallidus. And then this structure here, that is the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus looks like a big tadpole. It has a head in front, it has a body in the center, it has a tail on the end, and sitting on the tail of the caudate is this nucleus, and that is the amygdala. That's the amygdaloid nucleus. Years ago they thought it was archistriatum. In today's neuroscience it's believed to just be a part of the emotional cortical area or the insular cortex, the limbic system. In relationship to some of these nuclei, there's some general basal nuclear functions. The caudate nucleus is associated with cognitive or behavioral motor control. Okay, so things we know how to do or things that we do because of a learned behavior or a genetically transferred behavior. Caudate has a lot to do with that output. Putamen influences the operation of distal limb musculature. Okay, nucleus accumbens, once again associated with muscles of facial expression or emotional expression. Okay, so that in many ways is also behavioral. Globus pallidus is involved with what's called contratraverse movement. In other words, contratraverse is moving on a transverse plane to the opposite side. Okay, so from right to left, or left to right, or taking our arm and moving it from the center in a transverse plane out, abducting it out to the side. Those are contratraverse movements. Once again, the amygdala is not any more defined as a basal nuclei. It contributes to the limbic system. The old term archistriatum associated with it because it had to do with emotionally stimulated movements is no longer considered to be basal nuclear. It's considered to be limbic system. Here is a transverse section. Okay, so here is the putamen. Here is the lobus pallidus. And here is this is the head of the caudate up here, caudate nucleus. And then this area in here between this structure here, which is the thalamus, and the basal nuclei globus pallidus, that's the internal capsule. So in that pathway at that level, there are primarily E-parent fibers coming from the cerebral cortex, but also there may be A-parent fibers going to the cortex from the thalamus. That's the internal capsule. So that's the IC, not the HEC, but the IC. All right. Then there's a couple of other nuclei that are involved in this. Here, substantia nigra. There are two areas of cell populations here. It just means these nuclei appear very dark or black nuclei. Okay. Pars compacta is more dorsal or posterior, and it has cells which are dopaminergic. Okay. to the globus pallidus. It is inputs to the globus pallidus, okay? The pars reticulata, the ventral aspect of the substantia nigra, this is a GABAergic to the globus pallidus. Okay? So one is somewhat excitatory, one is somewhat inhibitory. The dopaminergic pathway is more excitatory, the GABAergic is more inhibitory. Then we have a group of nuclei that are down below the thalamus. They're not darkly colored or anything. They're called subthalamic nuclei. They're basically shaped, they're like spindle or cigar-shaped nuclear populations that are underneath the thalamus. Their output is excitatory or glutaminergic to both the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra. They are believed to be a clock of basal nuclei. In other words, it determines the output rhythm of these nuclear populations in relationship. The colostrum, which usually can be seen on most sections, on the outside surface of the putamen, even to this day, nobody knows what the colostrum cells are. But it's there and it's usually mentioned. Okay, so there are some circuitry associated with the basal nuclei and other areas, primarily the cerebral cortex, okay, in relationship to information. Okay, there's a loop between the cerebral cortex, primarily. Now, the basal nuclei has the greatest association with the supplementary motor cortex in relationship to movement patterns. So the motor loop, learned movements, planning ahead, complex motor intent, sequencing of movement, that's the motor loop. Ocular motor loop, that's the frontal eye fields. Remember this Brodmann's area 8, or the frontal eye fields down below supplementary motor cortex. Saccadic movement of the eyes, side to side, scanning movement of the eyes. Associative or prefrontal loop is cognitive, active knowing what you want to move, and the perception of what you hope to attain by this movement. Okay? It has a relationship, a strong relationship to the motor. The limbic loop, or these are emotional and motivational aspects of the movement, body language, motor expression, facial expression, and so on. All right, so how does this system work? And don't go crazy, it's complicated. But it's not that. The thalamus is an entity which is basically controlled under tonic inhibition. In other words, at most of the time there's something restricting information going through the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Because the thalamus are primarily the largest population of nuclei. They are relay nuclei receiving sensory information from somewhere in the body and sending it to the somatostatic cortex. Okay? But the thalamus can be selectively inhibited in terms of how that information, or how fast that information, or if that information is going to be sent upstream at all, depending upon what else is going on in the nervous system. So there are two pathways that are associated with basal nuclear control. Okay? And they receive, obviously, from a lot of areas. They regulate thalamic activity, which in turn regulates cortical activity, because the cortex will respond to the sensory information that the thalamus relates to. If it has to do with movement, and the thalamus sends more information in regards to areas wanting to move, then it's going to enhance movement. If it is inhibited and reduce the amount of thalamic output to the cortex, then the relationship to movement is going to be reduced, or it's going to be lessened. So there's a pathway called the direct pathway, and this selectively facilitates certain motor, cognitive, or movement patterns that are developed and are in relationship to adaptation for the present task. Through the disinhibition of the thalamus has an increase in the excitatory effect on the thalamus, and because of that, this facilitates target-oriented motor behaviors. Okay? So the thalamus is always being impacted by areas such as the globus pallidus. That's the primary output. And primarily the globus pallidus interna. And when the globus pallidus is how that's stimulated is the cortex stimulates the striatum, the putamen and the caudate. The caudate then releases GABA aminobutyric acid on the globus pallidus. So GABA aminobutyric acid is what type of a neurotransmitter? Is it excitatory or inhibitory? Okay. Bless you. It's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. Okay. So GABA aminobutyric acid is released onto the globus pallidus interna. The globus pallidus interna, its primary neurotransmitter is GABA aminobutyric acid. And it releases GABA aminobutyric acid on selective thalamic nuclei. So if the globus pallidus interna is not selectively inhibited by the striatum, it is going to have an effect of tonic inhibition on the thalamus. If the cortex decides to move, it's going to stimulate the striatum to be excited and to release GABA aminobutyric acid on the globus pallidus interna. That GABA aminobutyric acid is going to have a disinhibitory effect, okay, on the globus pallidus interna, okay? So what it's going to do, it's going to wind up reducing the amount of GABA aminobutyric acid is released by the globus pallidus interna on the thalamus, and the thalamus will be that much more excited and will send a greater amount of stimulus per unit time back to the cerebral cortex, and then will enhance movement. Okay? Got all that? Okay. We'll kind of see it, an example of that in a second. Okay. So here, so basically, the striatum is inhibiting GABA aminobutyric acid output of the globus pallidus on the thalamus, and therefore increasing its excitability. The indirect pathway simultaneously inhibits execution of competing motor programs, and it does this through a disinhibitory effect on not the globus pallidus interna, but on the subthalamic nuclei. And you see the subthalamic nuclei then being released will have an excitatory effect on the globus pallidus interna, causing the globus pallidus interna to release more GABA aminobutyric acid onto the thalamus and inhibit an increase in movement. Okay? All right, so that's basically a summary of this. Okay? Cortex is striatum. What's striatum? Caudate and putamen. It causes a output, which is an inhibitory pathway, or excitation is a white arrow. So you stimulate this up here, and that then has an effect down here to inhibit the output of the globus pallidus interna, which is GABA. So it reduces the amount of inhibition to the thalamus because it reduces the GABA output of the globus pallidus interna, and there is more movement. Now also the substantia nigra can play a role in here on both sides. It can actually excite the striatum just like the cortex, and it can wind up with dopamine, it can wind up increasing movement because it would have the same effect as cortical stimulation. Or it can inhibit the striatum in output and cause the globus pallidus interna not to release as much GABA on the thalamus, and the thalamus being blocked from transmission of further excitation. However, what happens here is we have the internal aspect of the globus pallidus, and there's an external aspect right against the putamen. And if we cite this, if we inhibit this, we reduce the effect of the globus pallidus externa, which is also a gamma aminobutyric acid releaser, on this, which is the subthalamic nuclei, which usually is held in check, has kind of has a input-output relationship to the globus pallidus externa, and this in turn excites this, the globus pallidus interna, causing it to increase its GABA-aminobutyric acid output to the thalamus and reducing the amount of movement. So direct pathway is a pathway that's primarily cortical in relationship to let's increase the amount, let's modulate the movement up, and in relationship to reducing movement on the globus pallidus externa to subthalamic nuclei to globus pallidus interna to reduce its output of gamma-aminobutyric acid. I mean, it increases the amount of butyric acid and causes the thalamus to be inhibited. Okay, so there's more reduction of movement. So the direct pathway, increased movement, indirect pathway, reducing. Okay, so then we've got some basal nuclear diseases, okay? So what we're talking about in relationship to basal nuclear diseases is not, in general, cerebellum it's ataxias, it's loss of coordination, okay, of movement. And basal nuclei, it's dyskinesia, it's a reduction in movement or some type of atypical movement, dyskinesia, okay? So we can have reduced movement or a hypokinesia, or we can have increased movement or a hyperkinesia. Hypokinesias are things that are slow movement, bradykinesia, okay? Rigid mask-like expressions. Okay, one of the primary disease states you will probably see in patient populations is a disease called paralysis agitans, Parkinson's disease, okay? And in Parkinson's disease, you can get not only an increase or a hyperkinesia, but you can also see a hypokinesia, in particular in relationship to slow shuffling gaits of the patient, or they will present to you with basically a rigid, mask-like expression, where maybe their lips move, but there's no other evidence of expressing anything in regards to how they're speaking to you in their facial expression. It's like frozen, like mask. Okay? So that's a hypokinesia. Some Parkinson's patients, at times, as they're moving through the environment that's really bad, they'll literally freeze them. They won't move at all. And it'll take a while to get them to move again. Take them a while. Hyperkinesia is some type of exacerbated movement, some type of movement that is over and above what the normal movement would be. Okay, so we talked about an intention tremor in cerebellar disease being associated with, as the person begins to move, they start to shake. In the case of Parkinson's disease, we get this hyperkinesia where when they are sitting there resting, they are shaking. And they'll be like this, okay? And it's not, they're not easy patients per se to work on because of the movement, so you gotta work a little slower with them as you can work with them. So, but when they move, they stop shaking. A typical type of movement that they do like this is rub their thumb against their index finger like they have a pill or a ball between their thumb and their index finger, so they call it pill rolling. They call it pill rolling. That's a hyperkinesia. Okay? Also, they have tics. A tic is a spontaneous movement without any so to speak, idea that it's coming. It just happens. Okay, there is a verbal type entity that comes called Tourette's syndrome, where all of a sudden the person is going through, they're sitting there, they're standing there, they're walking through, and they blurt something out, usually something inappropriate in their population. Okay? But this is a tic. This is a vocal tic, a spontaneous motor entity. Okay? Or this is called Tourette's. That's what Tourette's syndrome is. ballism, okay? We're talking about ballism. We're not talking about what you're thinking, okay? We're talking about a ballistic movement. A ballistic movement. So, spontaneous flinging, arm, leg, both arms, or something like that. A movement, a gross movement of a large muscle, okay? Group, okay? And so if it happens typically one-sided, typically it's hemiballistic. Okay? Sometimes there are athetoid movements. Athetoid movements are not only do they have this flinging, but they have like this writhing, snake-like movement as they have this ballistic movement. That's called a snake-like movement or an athetoid.
So for patients that exhibit Tourette's and ballism, is Tourette's strictly both the tics,
Yes.
and then ballism is just kind of.
Might have large movement. And in certain diseases, like Huntington's disease, there's ballistic movements. That, for example, in something like Tourette's, you don't typically see necessarily a combination of traits for a lot of other vasonuclear problems. Okay? So then there are athetoid movements, you get this. Or when they speak, because they have this hyperactivity in relationship to their tongue, they also have a dysarthria. Okay? So the movie power, their tongue or their tongue speak, so they have a dysarthria, a problem with pronouncing language. Okay? Now there's a particular vasonuclear disease where this almost always happens. Okay, you know what disease that is? Okay, you can go down the list, that's cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy typically happens at premature birth, where there's an excess, where the livers aren't quite mature enough to deal with the red cell breakdown, and you're throwing all of the biliary molecules into the bloodstream, and basonuclear neurons are one of the most primarily affected by that, by bilirubin. And you have to pick that up fast, and you have to deal with it fast. Do you know what they do? Have you ever, did your parents ever tell you that you were too early? Okay. So, they take the infant, and they bandage its head, its eyes, but they leave its arms and legs uncovered, and they put it under ultraviolet light. Because their skins are so thin at that point in time that the UV light can break down the bilirubin inside of their venous channels as it's circulating. So that's something that they try early on to deal with. If not, they may wind up with severe cerebral palsy. About 2 in 1,000 patients have cerebral palsy because of premature growth. So, and that's caused by kernicterus. If you have excessive bile, you will have, like in hepatitis, you will have yellow sclera, okay, yellow skin. That's what kernicterus means, okay, which is hyperbilirubinemia. And usually adults don't get secondarily cerebral palsy, but infants do in their early developmental stage. Torticollis is a dysphonia. Torticollis you also see in cerebral palsy, where their head is kind of locked in a twisted position, and there's nothing they can do about it. Okay. And one thing I will say to you, which if you see patients like this in your practice, and you're going to go to pediatric dentistry, you'll see a lot of them. Okay, they're not easy, obviously, to handle in a general dental type environment, but they are not retarded. Some of them are extremely retarded. Okay. This is not a form of retardation. This is a motor system disease. Okay? So treat them with respect. Okay? They're actually very bright kids, and they try to communicate the best they can. All right, then there's a couple of sheets I gave for you in relation to Parkinson's, paralysis, agitans. There's another. Just let me mention it. There's 3 other. Huntington disease is an autosomal dominant. The patients usually don't survive very long. Oh, okay. But Sydenham's disease, or Sydenham's chorea, it takes place usually in young women. in relationship to a strep-related disease induced with rheumatic fever, and they lined up with, they're sitting on the table that went up like a marionette-type motor response, and it's called cytokine chorea. Wilson's disease, they have this molecular disorder associated with copper, and you will see green rings around the few. So if you ever see this, called all right, so that's okay. I didn't think I'd get this far anyway. But like I say, your renal and blood scores will be posted.
You have a blood test back?
Blood test? They haven't given me that.